The day we moved into our new house, everything seemed perfect. The neighborhood was quiet, the houses well kept, and the people friendly. But there was one house next door that stood out, an old, decrepit structure that seemed out of place among the pristine homes. The neighbors warned us to stay away, whispering tales of its dark history. We learned that an old man named Mr. Whitaker lived there. He rarely left his house, and when he did, it was only at night. His gaunt, pale appearance and hollow eyes sent shivers down my spine every time I caught a glimpse of him through the window. At night, strange noises emanated from the house. Low whispers, eerie creaks, and sometimes a haunting wail that echoed through the neighborhood. My husband dismissed it as the wind or animals, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. One evening, I decided to investigate. I walked around the house, peering into the darkened windows. What I saw made my blood run cold. Shadows moved inside, shapes that didn't belong to any human. I quickly retreated, my heart pounding in my chest. Pets in the neighborhood began to go missing. Cats, dogs, even birds, they all disappeared without a trace. People began to suspect Mr. Whitaker, but there was no evidence. The neighbors grew more fearful, and the whispers grew louder. One night, there was a knock on our door. It was Mr. Whitaker. He invited us to dinner, claiming he wanted to get to know his new neighbors. My husband, ever the skeptic, agreed. I reluctantly followed, my gut screaming at me to run. The inside of Mr. Whitaker's house was a stark contrast to the outside. It was immaculate, almost too perfect. The dinner was elaborate, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of my vision, disappearing when I tried to focus on them. After dinner, Mr. Whitaker offered to show us his basement, where he claimed to have a fascinating collection. My husband eagerly agreed, but I hesitated. The basement door creaked open, and a foul smell wafted out. We descended the stairs, and my heart sank with each step. The basement was filled with jars containing strange, grotesque specimens. Animal parts, organs, and things I couldn't identify floated in murky liquid. Mr. Whitaker's eyes gleamed with a mad light as he explained each one, his voice dripping with pride. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my husband's arm and dragged him up the stairs, ignoring Mr. Whitaker's protests. We ran out of the house, slamming the door behind us. My husband was finally convinced something was terribly wrong with our neighbor. The next day, I began researching Mr. Whitaker. I found old newspaper articles about mysterious deaths and disappearances in the neighborhood, all linked to the house next door. The previous owners had all met gruesome ends, and Mr. Whitaker was always a suspect, but nothing was ever proven. We decided to confront Mr. Whitaker. Gathering a few brave neighbors, we knocked on his door. He greeted us with a sinister smile, as if he had been expecting us. We demanded answers, but he only laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the night. Mr. Whitaker revealed the truth. He was a collector, but not of the ordinary kind. He collected souls using dark rituals to trap them in his jars. The shadows we had seen were the spirits of his victims, forever trapped in torment. We fought back, destroying his jars and breaking his hold over the spirits. The house shook, and Mr. Whitaker's screams filled the air as the spirits were freed. In a final act of defiance, he lunged at us, but the spirits dragged him away, disappearing into the darkness. The house next door burned to the ground that night. The neighborhood was finally at peace, but the memories of Mr. Whitaker and his horrors remained. We moved away, unable to bear the memories. To this day, I can still hear the whispers and feel the shadows watching, a constant reminder of the true horror that lurked next door. When my family moved into our new home, we were thrilled. It was a fresh start in a charming suburban neighborhood. Our neighbors seemed friendly, except for one house at the end of the street. It was large, old, and always eerily quiet. Rumor had it that a woman named Mrs. Evelyn lived there. She was rarely seen, and when she was, she never spoke. Her presence was unsettling. She moved like a shadow, slipping in and out of view as if she were part of the house itself. Strange things began happening soon after we moved in. Items in our house would go missing, only to reappear in odd places. Footsteps echoed through our halls at night, though no one was there. My parents brushed it off, but I knew something was wrong. One evening, I saw Mrs. Evelyn standing at her window, staring at our house. Her eyes were hollow, her face pale and gaunt. She waved, a slow, deliberate motion that sent chills down my spine. I waved back, more out of fear than politeness. That night, I had a dream. Or was it a nightmare? I was in Mrs. Evelyn's house, wandering through dark, endless corridors. Whispers followed me, and unseen hands reached out from the shadows. I woke up drenched in sweat, the feeling of those hands lingering on my skin. The next day, I found an old diary hidden in our attic. It belonged to the previous owner, a young woman named Sarah. She wrote about strange occurrences and a silent neighbor who seemed to watch her every move. Her last entry was a desperate plea for help. Determined to find answers, I decided to investigate Mrs. Evelyn's house. One afternoon, while my parents were out, I snuck over and peered through the windows. The interior was dark and dusty, filled with old, decaying furniture. There was a sense of abandonment, yet it felt strangely alive. As I was about to leave, the front door creaked open. Mrs. Evelyn stood there, her eyes looking onto mine. She motioned for me to come in. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside, the door closing behind me with a foreboding thud. Inside, the house was a maze of shadows and whispers. Mrs. Evelyn led me to a room filled with old photographs and antiques. She spoke for the first time, her voice a raspy whisper. She told me about the house's dark history, of the tragedies that had befallen its inhabitants. She revealed that she was bound to the house by a pact made long ago, a pact with dark forces that required her to collect souls. She had watched over the neighborhood for decades, taking those who wandered too close. She warned me that I was now part of her collection. Panicked, I ran for the door, but the house seemed to twist and turn, preventing my escape. Shadows reached out, trying to pull me back. Just as I felt myself being dragged into the darkness, I woke up in my own bed, gasping for air. I thought it had all been a nightmare, but the diary was still in my hand. The events of the previous day were real. I told my parents, but they didn't believe me, thinking it was just a vivid dream. I knew I had to act before it was too late. Armed with the diary, I returned to Mrs. Evelyn's house, determined to break the pact. She was waiting for me, her eyes sad and weary. She admitted that she wanted to be free but didn't know how. Together, we searched for a way to end the curse. We found an old book of rituals hidden in the house. Following its instructions, we performed a ceremony to break the pact. The house shook, and shadows swirled around us, but we held firm. In a final burst of energy, the shadows dissipated, and Mrs. Evelyn collapsed, free at last. The house at the end of the street was finally silent. Mrs. Evelyn's spirit was at peace, and the strange occurrences ceased. We stayed in the neighborhood, but the memory of those dark days lingered. Every time I pass that house, I feel a sense of relief, knowing that the true horror of our silent neighbor is no more. When we bought the old Victorian house, we were excited about its charm and character. The previous owner, an elderly woman named Mrs. Abernathy, had passed away, and her family was eager to sell. We moved in, oblivious to the dark secrets that lay within. Our neighbor, Mr. Thompson, was an odd man. He always wore a hat and coat, regardless of the weather, and rarely spoke. He seemed to watch our house constantly, his piercing gaze following us whenever we stepped outside. It started with small things. Objects moved, cold spots in the house, and the feeling of being watched. My wife dismissed it as quirks of an old house, but I couldn't shake the sense that something was terribly wrong. One day, while exploring the attic, I found a hidden door behind an old wardrobe. It was small and covered in dust, as if it hadn't been opened in decades. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pried it open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading down. At the bottom of the stairs was a hidden room. It was filled with old furniture, dusty books, and strange artifacts. In the center of the room was a large, ornate mirror that seemed to glow with an otherworldly light. As I approached it, I felt a chill run down my spine. The mirror was unlike any I had ever seen. Its surface was smooth and flawless, yet it seemed to ripple and shimmer as if it were alive. When I looked into it, I saw not my reflection, but the image of Mrs. Abernathy, her face twisted in terror. The vision in the mirror grew clearer. I saw Mrs. Abernathy being pulled into the mirror by shadowy hands, her screams echoing in my ears. The mirror then showed images of other people, all being dragged into its depths, their faces contorted in agony. Panicked, I ran out of the room and sealed the door. I told my wife, but she didn't believe me, thinking I had imagined it. That night, I had a dream where Mrs. Abernathy appeared to me, warning me to leave the house before it was too late. The next day, Mr. Thompson approached me. He told me that the house had a dark history, and that Mrs. Abernathy had been involved in dark rituals. He revealed that the mirror was a portal to another realm, a place of torment and suffering. Mr. Thompson explained that Mrs. Abernathy had made a pact with dark forces, using the mirror to trap souls. He showed me an old book filled with rituals and incantations, and together we devised a plan to destroy the mirror and free the trapped souls. That night, we performed the ritual. As we chanted the incantations, the house shook and the mirror began to glow. Shadowy figures emerged from the mirror, their anguished cries filling the room. We held firm, determined to break the curse. The shadows attacked, trying to drag us into the mirror. We fought back, using the rituals and the artifacts we had found. It was a battle of wills, and just as we were about to be overwhelmed, the mirror shattered, sending a blinding light throughout the room. The light faded, and the shadows were gone. The room was filled with a sense of peace, and the cold spots in the house disappeared. We had succeeded in breaking the curse, but the toll it took on us was immense. We were exhausted but relieved. We decided to sell the house and move away. The memories of what had happened were too much to bear. We left the neighborhood, leaving behind the dark history and the haunted mirror. Mr. Thompson disappeared shortly after, his mission complete. We started a new life in a different town, but the experiences stayed with us. The haunted house and the hidden room became a distant memory, a tale we rarely spoke of. But every now and then I feel a chill and remember the horror that lurked in the mirror, a reminder that some secrets are best left buried.